Dan Jones for his new book, The Templars, The Rise and Spectacular Fall of God's Holy Warriors. The Knights Templar was a Catholic military order established in 1119, just after the First Crusade. Charged with protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, the order was supported by the wealthy and powerful of Europe and grew quickly. Templar Knights were skilled fighters, while other members of the group built fortifications and developed an early banking system. Formidable as they were, the Templars lost ground in the East and fell under suspicion in France, where hundreds were executed. After secret trials at the Vatican, the Templars disbanded in 1312. Their legend has haunted history ever since. The Guardian called this book another triumphant tale from a historian who writes as addictively as any page-turning novelist. And Publishers Weekly said, this is an engrossing examination of a period whose conflicts are still reverberating today. Dan Jones, is a historian, journalist, and author of 4 previous books. He's also produced and presented a number of television specials and a web series for the History Channel centered on the history of the Templars. Please help me in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
You get the comfy storyteller's chair. It's lovely to see you all here at Politics and Prose. Can you hear me? Well, okay, but I have to do this. I have to do this with ice cream. Okay. I'll say it again. Thank you for that kind introduction. You have the comfy chair. It's lovely to see you all at Politics and Prose, so many of you, in a bookshop that I'm going to go ahead and say it and annoy all the other bookshops when they see the video. Is one of my very, very favourites, and I think this is the third or maybe even the 4th time I've been here, and I just love it. But this is the first time I've been here talking about the Templars. It's the first time I've been here talking about one of my books that isn't about England or France in the Middle Ages. And as I've been going around on book tour, people have been saying, why? Why, you know, you've written a lot of books about the Plantagenets, about the Wars of the Roses, about, you know, Magna Carta and so on. Why move field? You rather enjoyed what you were doing. And so I think before I tell you about the Templars themselves, I'd like to just explain why I've written about them and what it is that drew me first to this subject. And I'll go back and start with a ghost story. Does anyone like ghost stories? Is anyone absolutely terrified by ghost stories? It'll be fine, don't worry. It's not real. This is a safe space. Mostly. Until we get on to this. Right, I'll tell you a ghost story because it's a ghost story my father used to tell me at Christmas time. And it's a ghost story by a great medievalist, M.R. James. M.R. James was a fellow at Cambridge, and he translated some of the best medieval chronicles. He was a brilliant scholar, but he had a sort of sideline in writing terrifying ghost stories. And he used to write them very hastily in longhand and then sit his students down late at night by candlelight and tell them these terrifying stories. Well, my dad used to tell these terrifying stories at Christmas time and try to inflict psychological damage on his children. We're not here to talk about my dad. And the one story that really sticks in my mind by M.R. James is called Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. And if you know this story, then it's about an academic, much like M.R. James, who's at high table in Cambridge or Oxford. And he says he's going up on holiday to the northeast of England, which is a bleak and miserable. I know you think England's all bleak and miserable. The northeast of England's especially bleak and miserable. And he goes up, and another academic asked him before he leaves, he said, could you investigate an archaeological site that's in this place you're going on holiday? He says, of course. He says, it's a Templar commandery, the ruins of a Templar commandery. He says, of course, you know, what's worse that can happen? He doesn't know he's in an M.R. James story. And so he goes up and he sort of roots around. He stays in a kind of a little boarding house. He roots around in the ruins of this Templar commandery. He finds a whistle, blows the whistle. Terrible thing to do. And when he goes back to his boarding house, the little hotel he's staying in, awful things start happening. I mean, it won't sound awful when I tell you because I'm not M.R. James, but basically his bed sheets become a monster and start terrifying him. And that's that's really the sort of the scary bit of the story. But the bit that stuck in my mind when I was thinking about that is why the Templars? Why did this whistle that summoned up the ghosts of the undead made out of this professor's bedsheet? Why did they come from a Templar preceptory? He could have chosen, as a medievalist, anything. Right? Anything. He could have chosen a monastery, he could have chosen Benedictine monastery, a Cistercian monastery, a house belonging to the Hospitallers, a house belonging to the Teutonic Knights, a house belonging to the Order of St. Lazarus, you name it. But it was the Templars. And so when I was thinking of subjects to write about, I thought, what is something from the Middle Ages that has burst out of the Middle Ages, if you like, into the popular consciousness? To such a degree that it's included in ghost stories. And because of course it's not just M.R. James who wrote about the Templars. It's that other famous Dan Brown. The Da Vinci Code, which I won't recite the plot of the Da Vinci Code. It's even scarier than M.R. James. Dan Brown, of course, written about the Da Vinci Code. The younger people among you may have played a computer game called Assassin's Creed, in which the Templars are time-travelling sort of villains. Umberto Eco wrote about the Templars and Foucault's Pendulum as being sort of agents of global conspiracy. Sir Walter Scott wrote about the Templars and Ivanhoe. The Templars have broken into popular culture in a way that almost no other organisation or group from the Middle Ages has managed to do. And so there was a real draw, in my mind, to this subject for that reason, to try and look at why the history, the real history of this group has left such a profound mark on our mental landscape. Now, when I then started to write the book, I made a decision that actually sort of threw all of that in the trash and said, when I write this book, what I'm not going to do is start with the mythology. In fact, to write this book, before I get going, I'm going to clear the mythology off the table and try and put the idea of the Templars as guardians of the Holy Grail, or keepers of the Turin Shroud, or descendants of the ancient Egyptians, or wizards of the High Hocus Pocus. I'm going to put all that out of my mind and get back to what was happening in the Middle Ages with the Templars, who they were, where they came from, why such an organisation was set up, what they were really all about. And I did that with some trepidation, because by this point I'd actually signed the deal and I knew how to write a book about the Templars. What if I write the most boring book of all time? I'm sweeping all the exciting bits off the floor. But of course I needn't worry, because the real story of the Templars turned out, in my mind at least, to be at least as, and probably more exciting than all the craziness. So let me, in brief, because I'm not going to explain it in too much length, because I want you to read the book, but let me in brief explain what the Templars were all about. And to do that, we have to go back to about nearly 1,000 years, to the time of the First Crusade, end of the 11th century. 1096, 1099, Christian armies from the west marched on the Holy Land, conquered a series of cities and territories, culminating in a violent and very dramatic siege of Jerusalem. Jerusalem fell to Western occupation, and it stayed that way for more than nearly a century. Now, that's the point at which I started writing this book. And the first documents that I looked at when I sat down to write about the Templars was the most amazing document. I was a little worried when I approached this book that I knew my way around the sources of medieval England, medieval France, but I wasn't sure what to expect when I approached the sources of the Crusades. And in fact, they're incredible. They're so rich, they're so voluminous. There are sources from Christian writers in the East, Christian writers in the West, Muslim writers in various different cities of different allegiances. It's brilliant. But the first document that left a really big impression on me was a document that I read by a traveller, probably a British traveller, who went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem shortly after it had fallen to European Western occupation. And he kept a journal. I don't know if at school any of you had to write what I did in the holidays. We always had to do that after the summer holidays. This is exactly what it reads like. And his name's Sailwolf. He writes this brilliant account of coming to Jerusalem just after the First Crusade, in 1102 to 1103. He's gone on pilgrimage to what he described as the centre of the world, a place where Christ's ministry had taken place and where he had died. And Ceolwulf keeps this extraordinary record of the hardship of the journey. He's shipwrecked twice on his journey. He gets to Jerusalem, he's kind of blown away by the majesty, the kind of the overwhelming spiritual experience of being the heart of the world. But he also writes about the terrible dangers on the roads around Jerusalem, of the risk of being robbed, the risk of being killed, the risk of brigands appearing from the hills as you're travelling between Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Nazareth and all the other holy sites of that region. And he has this memorable line where he sees the bodies of other pilgrims lying by the side of the road, being killed by brigands. And he says your natural instinct is to stop and bury these poor people, give them a good Christian burial, but you can't, because anyone who does that would be digging a grave for himself. That line really stuck in my mind. Because it's out of this experience, out of this this awareness among pilgrims of the inherent danger of travelling to Jerusalem and to the Holy Land, that the idea of the Templars is born. And it's born in 1119 to 1120 by, from the brain of a man called Hudipan. And Hudipan is a knight. He's travelled to Jerusalem on crusade, on armed pilgrimage. He's decided to stay, and with a group of his friends, somewhere between 9 and 30, the accounts vary, they decide to set up what amounts to a sort of roadside rescue service for pilgrims. Because in Jerusalem there's a pilgrim hospital. If you fall sick, if you're a pilgrim in Jerusalem, there is a free hospital that will look after you. You don't have to have insurance, you don't have to have anything. If you're a pilgrim, they will look after you. It's like being in England, actually, for the time being. Let's not get into that. They decide to set up effectively a sort of private security service, armed bodyguards that will look after pilgrims on the roads around Jerusalem. And this idea becomes immensely popular. They go to the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, and say, here's our idea. They pitch him the idea. I was describing it earlier as a little like you're kind of pitching a TV show, which alas I've done too many times, to a sort of a slightly cynical network controller. They go to the king of Jerusalem and say, hey, look, we've got this great idea. We're going to look after pilgrims. All we need is somewhere to live, money to buy weapons and uniform, food. And he says, yeah, that's great. So they're housed in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on top of the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount. A place that's identified by the Christian occupiers of Jerusalem with the Temple of Solomon. And so this little band, living in what they think of as the Temple of Solomon, becomes known as the Order of the Poor Knights of the Temple. Poor because they've taken vows of poverty, as well as chastity and obedience, and of the Temple because they're living in the Temple. So therein lie the origins of the Templars. They start off as a pilgrim bodyguard. But very quickly the organisation begins to mutate, begins to change, begins to develop. And because of their recruiting policy, which is to recruit skilled knights who feel slightly bad about the fact that they've devoted their lives to killing other human beings, and would quite like a way to reconcile that with the duties of being a good Christian, turn the other cheek and all that. They have an extremely potent promise, which is if you're a knight and you join this order, the stuff that you've been doing all your life, which you might have categorised as homicide, can now be recategorised as malicide, the killing of evil. So they start to recruit very heavily. They also start to attract donations rapidly, very, very rapidly. Donations from ordinary people who, leaving this organisation of the Templars, the records have people leaving them a part of a vineyard, a horse, their coat, literally whatever they can leave. At the other end of the scale, you have kings and queens donating landed estates. Alfonso I, King of Aragon, leaves the Templars a third of his kingdom, which they have to go through some long legal battles to try and claim, and eventually end up with quite a few rather nice castles, if not a third of the kingdom. So very rapidly, this organisation, which starts as a sort of ad hoc pilgrim bodyguard, becomes rich, becomes renowned across the world, and it also becomes militarily very capable. So the next phase of Templar history in the 12th century, the 1100s, is of their development from a pilgrim bodyguard into an elite military force, comparable, I think, to the Navy SEALs, Green Berets, the SAS, the French Foreign Legion. They're the crack troops fighting at either the rear guard or the vanguard, depending on the campaign, of Crusader armies, fighting in sieges around cities like Damascus, going down to the Nile Delta, fighting in the mountains of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, building warships capable of attacking castles by the side of rivers and sea, building enormous military complexes, castles. They built a castle, Chateau Pèlerin, Athlete, that was so large, people couldn't believe that it had been built, number one. They couldn't believe it had been built so quickly, number two. And when you read descriptions of the the sort of military installation the Templars were building, it reminds me of something like the Green Zone in Baghdad. It's this vast complex which can house thousands of men. It can stable thousands of horses and camels. The staircases are so wide that knights can ride a horse around the whole complex. It has a deep water harbour. It's an extraordinary piece of military architecture. And so during that phase of Templar history, I think this is when our idea of the Templars that is there in popular culture, that image of the Templars, if you have one when you close your eyes, that's when this arises, because by this stage they have a uniform, which for Templar knights is white robes emblazoned with a red cross. For Templar sergeants and chaplains, black robes emblazoned with a red cross. It's an extraordinary piece of branding. It's the sort of equivalent of the Nike swoosh or the Apple logo or the McDonald's arches of its day. I'm only being slightly flippant here. This is this cross, which we've reproduced on the cover of the book, is instantly readable. In an international organisation in which people would have spoken lots of different languages, you just have to look at the cross and you see what's at the heart of Templar ideology. It is supposed to represent the blood that Christ shed for mankind and the blood the Templars are prepared to shed in pursuit of his name, his kingdom. And some of the campaigns which when I was researching this book, I thought I'd seen battle. I've written about the Wars of the Roses. I was like, I don't know what medieval battles are all about. And then you write about a battle like the Battle of Hattin in 1187. The Crusader army, tens of thousands strong, was marched into the desert by an army commanded by the great Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin, and was marched out of range of water and was allowed to get thirstier and thirstier as Saladin's men burned the desert scrub around them, walked them into a vision, deliberately created a vision of the hell that he thought was awaiting these soldiers, and then sent his men to slaughter them. Captured the king, captured the holiest relic in the Christian Holy Lands, the relic of the True Cross, and then captured Jerusalem. And writing about these battles, the Battle of Hattin, the battles that followed it when Richard the Lionheart came in the Third Crusade, the battles of the Fifth Crusade in the Nile Delta, the battles of Louis IX of France's Crusade again in the Nile Delta, where you have these enormous armies with Templars either at the front or the rear, marching through hostile terrain in pursuit of often impossible ends and impossible goals. It's just a gift to the historian and to the writer to have this material and to bring it alive. Anyway, that's really the second phase of Templar history. The third phase of Templar history, which I describe in this, is I think probably the least known, in the sense that you will often hear that the Templars described as bankers. They were the world's first bankers. They had a system where you could turn up at a Templar house in London or Paris or Rome, deposit your money, get a chit, take it out in Jerusalem or Constantinople or wherever else you found the Templars. And when I started to look into that aspect of their history, I found that actually it was much more complex than that, and that the Templars really, far from being the world's first bankers, were sort of providing the world's first financial services. It wasn't a case of banking deposit, although that was part of Templar history. They were also subcontracting treasury functions on behalf of the French crown. For 100 years, the Templars of Paris effectively ran the French treasury. They kept all the accounts for the King of France, they kept accounts for the King of France's relatives, his mother, his brothers. They kept they paid royal officials. They were in charge of the really boring business of government on behalf of kings. They were used by popes to collect taxes, which, I mean, is there anything more boring than taxes? No, but there's nothing more complex than taxes either. And the Templars were used to collect tax for Crusades. They were sent around Europe from Ireland and England to Cyprus and Hungary, collecting Crusade taxes, amassing the money, and then taking the money physically into a war zone, which, when you think about it, is an act of logistics, as well as an act of coercion in forcing people to part with their money for a crusade that might be thousands of miles away, is truly extraordinary. So you have this amazing development in the Templars, from pilgrim bodyguards to elite troops to providers of financial services. And then you come to, for me, what was for me the most moving and the hardest part of this book to write, which is the phase of Templar history, which I think has lent itself most to the creation of Templar legend. And that is the fall of the Templars. It's a story that began in really began in 1291 with the fall of the Crusader states in the Holy Land, but which had its dramatic denouement on Friday the 13th of October 1307, where, having fallen foul of, or rather fallen into the sights of, the King of France, Philip IV, who was in dire need of money to pay off war debts mainly, the Templars were en masse in France, arrested at dawn one day, Friday the 13th, taken off to be imprisoned, tortured, and subjected to show trials in which they were accused of a litany of crimes against decency, against their Christian obligations, against their vows as Templars. And I wrote the last quarter of this book, which deals with the trial of the Templars, in about 6 weeks, very intensely, because I wanted to give a lot to this part of the story and to be very immersed in it. And of all the parts of the Templar story, this is the one that's left the most evidence, but it's also the one that's left the most problematic and troublesome and difficult and actually slightly harrowing evidence, because the trial records of this organisation, which had many faults, but had also provided, within the context of its world, an incredible service for nearly 2 centuries, they're really quite difficult to read. You have men rounded up one morning, taken into prison, tortured in really grotesque ways, such that some of them say they would rather be burned to death or boiled to death than suffer one more day of tortuous conditions in which they're being kept, and forced to admit to a list of 80-some crimes each. Very formulaic, very deliberately constructed, which almost all of which academics will agree are bogus charges. They were made to admit that they spat on the cross, that they'd trampled on the cross, that they'd denied Christ, that they'd worshipped false idols, that they'd engaged in lewd induction ceremonies in which they'd kissed each other, that they'd been forced to have sexual relations with one another, or told that this was a compulsory part of being in the order. A set of accusations and a set of crimes that was deliberately constructed to break down public faith in and public trust in the order, and which was then relentlessly hammered home by the process of public trials of member after member after member after member after member after member after member of the Templars, all forced to come out in public and admit to this list of crimes that they basically hadn't committed and wouldn't even have countenanced. And then, after 5 years of sustained political pressure, the order, at a council one day, a council of the church, held in Vienne, 1311 to 1312, at which the Templars were not allowed to represent themselves, and an army of the King of France was waiting 15 miles down the road in case the church council came up with the wrong verdict. The organisation was gone. Members were sent off to live in retirement in monasteries, or in some cases allowed to join other military orders, but in very few cases actually. Their wealth from their treasury in Paris disappeared. Their property was given to another military order, the Hospitallers, I mentioned earlier, and that was the story of them. And it's a very sad ending. And you may, there's a postscript in which the last Templar master, James of Molay, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris after being brought out for his final public trial. And the accounts of Jacques de Molay's final public trial are actually completely terrible to read. He was, having been in prison for 7 years and had his reputation trashed, his spirit broken, his body broken, having seen the organisation he served his entire life to lead broken up. He was then forced to come out in public and admit this whole list of crimes he hadn't committed. He broke. He retracted his confession. That made him a lapsed heretic, and he was burned at the stake. To which he went, apparently cursing his enemies, Philip IV of France and Clement V, the Pope. Anyway, that in potted terms is the history of the Templars, but of course it's not the whole history of the Templars, because as I said at the beginning, if that were the history of the Templars, and that was all there was to it, then we wouldn't have M.R. James writing ghost stories, we wouldn't have the Templars appearing in the Da Vinci Code, we wouldn't have the Templars occupying this place in popular consciousness today. And so the other side of the Templar story, and the side that I think you can never ignore, I tried to ignore it when I started writing this book, and finished writing the book realizing that it was absolutely essential, is the mythology of the Templars, is this kind of, this skin, this fog of mystery, of mystique, of legend and of myth that hangs around the order, and has done, actually ever since the Templars were around. In 1200 to 1210, the legends of King Arthur were being written. And in Germany, the writer Wolfram von Eschenbach placed the Templars into one of his, in the story of Parsifal, as guardians of an object called the Grail, which there was some confusion what the Grail was. Was it a cup? Was it a magical stone? Was it weirdly a fish plate? Never really hear of the Holy Grail as a fish plate, but that was one interpretation of what it might originally have been. So even from the time that the Templars were active, and in some senses at their peak, they were being written into mythology, written into folklore, written into the public consciousness and the popular imagination. And actually now I've written the book, I'm as interested in the Templars' place in our minds, in our culture, mythological or historical, as I am in the absolutely compelling and totally brilliant and fascinating real history of the order. And so I'll go back to the question that people have been asking me, why write about the Templars? Because having thought about all of this and thinking about this book and about the Templars themselves as I'm travelling around on a book tour at the moment, the other realisation that I've had is that this isn't only a fascinating piece of medieval history. It's also a story that has, if not direct relevance, which is a word that historians often feel a bit twitchy about using, then certainly incredibly powerful resonance for us today, because it's a story that's about an apparently ceaseless war in the Middle East, in which factions of Sunni and Shia Islam fighting in Syria, in Egypt, in Palestine, react to the intervention of a militant Christian West, which enters this arena with good intentions, or so they claim, and then swiftly finds they can't get out. It's a story of a losing game in the Middle East, a tragically losing game in the Middle East. It's also a story of the heroism of elite military units. It's a story of men highly trained who devoted their lives to becoming experts in the business of armed conflict against other human beings and military targets being sent against impossible odds to do jobs that the people sending them probably wouldn't do themselves. It's a story that anyone who knows about the deeds of the armed services of this country and of my country and of many other countries in the West today will feel some sympathy. It's a story about international finance, about an organisation that became so wealthy through a highly diversified set of businesses and a very lucrative set of tax breaks, that it could operate in multiple terrains without being answerable to the governments of those regions, that became so wealthy that it could effectively influence foreign policy, that broke free in the most disruptive way from the traditional structures of power. It's a story that if you're at all interested in Facebook, you'll recognise. Not quite yet, but that might be where they go. It's a story in its end, in its denouement, however, and this is what gets me the most. It's a story in its tragic ending that is actually about medieval fake news. It's about the power of the state and of the apparatus of state and of the position of political leaders being abused through the telling of lies again and again and again and again and again until they appear true, or until truth appears to be a movable issue, a movable conceit in which no one is really sure what the truth is or what to believe, but the endless repetition of lies eventually takes you to your political goal. And so in all of those senses, I hope what I've written here isn't just a book that's about the Middle Ages, although it is, and I hope it's, if you're into medieval history, I hope you enjoy this book as much as you've enjoyed the Wars of the Roses, the Plantagenets, any of my other books, because it's written with that sensibility, I promise you. But I hope it's also a book that, more than any other book that I've written, will make you think about the world today as it connects with the world over the last 1,000 years, but ultimately the world as it is now and the world as it might be tomorrow. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions until they tell me to stop. So if you come to the microphone, form an orderly queue. 2 people will count. You can jump up. Please do jump up, and others please follow.
Teacher here.
Stick into the microphone. Then they'll be
Is it on?
Oh, it is.
Yes, it is. Okay. I'm wondering about the numbers. Do you have any idea of how many knights there were that actually went to the Middle East? Because I thought maybe it was 1,000, but I'm getting the impression you said 2,000. And who were they? Were they the second sons of wealthy landowners, etc.?
So how many Templars were there and who were they? The numbers are quite small in one sense and quite large in another. And let me unpack that. In the Middle East, let's say, the height of the Templar period, let's say the end of the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century, we can't be totally certain, but there are probably between about 1,000 and 1,300 Templar Knights in the Middle East, which is not a very great deal, considering that they're spread sometimes from Gaza in the south, Jerusalem, all the way to northern Syria, the mountain passes into what we now call Turkey. However, that's Templar Knights in the Middle East, and that's really the tip of the iceberg, because the rest of the organisation, really what gave the Templars their power and their sustainability and their remarkable ability to bounce back from repeated military humiliation, was the organisation that lay beneath. In the East, besides the Knights, you had a large army of Templar sergeants who might have combat roles but might also have engineering roles, or cooking roles, or architectural roles, or building. They hired mercenaries, both Christian and Muslim mercenaries. Turcopoles, the sort of Muslim-like cavalry, were a big part of the Templar military force. When I was talking about armies of tens of thousands, I was talking about Crusader armies in which the Templars would be a small component. But then you also had this enormous organisation in Western Europe, in Templar houses, which would not have been military installations, which would have resembled quite humble monasteries, in which the lives of the brothers who, and in some cases sisters, who lived and worked there, would have largely resembled those of Cistercian monks. So you had a very, very large organisation with a relatively small military tip. And very briefly, with regard to who these people were, it varied across time. At the beginning, they recruited anyone. The rule from the 1160s, 1170s suggests that they wanted to recruit only, as knights, only men who were born of knightly families, knightly rank. By definition, it probably wouldn't be the eldest son, it would be the younger sons, because the eldest son would have a role in inheriting property and managing family estates. But I think in real terms, there were times when you take what you get. There were times after the Battle of Hattin when the Templars had been half wiped out, where recruiting was urgent. And when those rules were written saying, we only want to recruit from knightly families, you only write a rule because that's not what's happening at the moment. So, I mean, there was obviously at that point a concern that recruitment was slipping in standard. Thank you for your question.
One question coming. What would be the relative appeal of joining the Knights of the Templars as opposed to other orders? Specifically, to the Knights of Malta and the Order of Teutonic Knights.
What would be the appeal of joining the Templars as opposed to other military orders? I thought about that question when I was in the Temple Church in London, because buried in the Temple Church in London is William Marshall, self-proclaimed greatest knight. And friendly, other people probably agreed to it up to a point. But William Marshall's buried in the Temple Church in London. The reason he's buried in the Temple Church in London, there's beautiful tomb effigies there, is because on his deathbed, William Marshall joined the Templars. He'd been to Jerusalem around the time of the Third Crusade, and although it would be inconvenient to his career to be a Templar, on his deathbed, he took his vows and died a Templar. So he was buried in the Temple Church in London, and symbolically, that for him must have been the apotheosis of knighthood. That must have been the big one, the top, the absolute end goal of knighthood. Now, why the Templars are one of the Hospitallers, or the Teutonic Knights, part of that comes down to a fact of geography. The Templars were strongly, I mean, they recruited from Ireland, Scotland, England, France, Italy, the Spanish kingdoms, Portugal, Croatia, Hungary, some of the German states, but they were strongest where they began, in central France and subsequently in England as well. Those were really the heartlands of Templar recruitment. The Hospitallers crossed a similar area, but also recruited from Italy more than the Templars did. The Teutonic Knights were very much a product of the German kingdoms. Well, the Knights of Malta were a sort of later manifestation of the Hospitallers. But then, you had many military orders in Spain, for example, which were connected with the individual kingdoms of Spain. So there was a geographical component to a lot of recruitment. But I think Templars were probably the coolest. I mean, I'm slightly biased. There was something in the fact that the Templars were founded as a military order and not as a hospital, and that they were called the Templars. Their name spoke very deeply to the holiest site in Christianity.
I read a book called Born in Blood, and they talk about the Templars as it's connected to the Freemasons. Do you believe in that connection? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the connection between the Templars and the Freemasons is retrospective in the sense that Freemasonry during the 18th and 19th century began to search for a history that would imply sort of more ancient roots than Freemasonry actually had. and there was an attempt to draw lines of descent or lines of connection all the way back to the Templar period. And that connection has actually proved to be quite effective, because people now do associate the Templars as being direct antecedents of Freemasons, but I don't think that link is particularly true. I mean, it's nice, like, you know, we can all share in the Templars. Why not?
You must have done a massive amount of research for this book, and I imagine that the documents were written in medieval Latin and other perhaps languages. How long have you been able to read these documents? How did you come by the knowledge of medieval Latin? How many years?
Medieval Latin is really horrible. So, yes, you're absolutely right. More than any other book I've written, the documents have been produced in a large variety of languages. Medieval Latin I learned just after I'd finished my undergraduate degree. But unless you work in medieval Latin all the time, it's still a real slow process of decoding, because often it's written in contracted Latin, but it's something that if you spend every day doing, you're able to get the gist of what you're working with. The same goes for medieval French, German, English, doesn't really come into it here. On occasion, if I need, I use specialist researchers. I don't read Arabic. However, the great thing about Crusade studies is over the last 100 years, there's a wealth of academic work to build on, in which the sources have been transcribed, often translated either into French or into English, in very reliable academic editions. And so that's a great help to anyone studying this topic today. And what I've tried to do in the book, for anyone who wants to take it further, in the end notes of the book, is to point towards the sources that I've used, obviously, but also the convenient and most academically reliable translations where they exist in relatively easily available editions, and preferably where you can see the two beside one another. So you know, if you have the language, then you can compare and analyse the translation. If you don't, then at least you have something to read to go deeper into the subject.
Well, to do this research, you must have visited a number of libraries, museums, archives, and perhaps some obscure places. Could you tell us where you went and the number of countries, and which countries, and what kind of archives you visited?
Actually, for this book, weirdly, I mean, I visited more archives writing previous books about medieval England. And part of that is to do with the way that research is changing and the way that libraries are changing, because so much material now has been put online. And so much material that I would have, say I was writing this book 20 years ago, I've had to travel to archives in the United States, all over Britain, in France. The big universities and the big public libraries across the world are engaged in a huge process of digitizing their collections, particularly their older collections, so that if you use a tool like archive.org, you're able to call up, or if you go to any of the very big archives at the moment, including the National Archives in Kew, so much material is being digitized now that a massive amount of research I would have had to do 20 years ago on foot, I can now do sitting at my desk at home. Well, and then there's good things and there's bad things about it. The good thing is that this book came out after 3 years rather than after 10 years. The bad thing is that one is aware that the perspective of my desk, although pleasant, you know, my children can run in and out and the dog can kind of scratch at me forlornly wishing it could go for a walk, is not as stimulating as visiting the archive. So there's a little that's lost in that as well.
How wonderful to have a historian who's such a wonderful storyteller orally and writing too. And how lucky your children are in some ways.
They would dispute that.
Yeah. I just wanted you to comment on literacy and the Templars. What was the education level? Were they given education? Were they attracted? So the role of the book.
The role of the book, the role of literacy in the Templars.
And then the other question, and you can just choose one. I don't want to hog the time, but the other one is celibacy. I guess that the link between celibacy and inheritance, and was that partly a way for the Templar institution to control the funds?
So let's take those in reverse order. Celibacy and inheritance. Yeah, a major part of recruitment for the Templars was that people often came bearing land. And you had to swear, if you joined the Templars, that you weren't, for example, married. Or there were rigorous checks on everyone who joined the order to make sure that effectively if the Templars could lay claim to their property, they would. And so celibacy, yes, absolutely did have a role to play in that. Although I think it was not totally cynical in the sense that there was also, the Templars were founded on Cistercian values, on the reform monastic values of the early 12th century, and celibacy was a routine part of that. With regard to literacy, if you go back to the Templar rule, which exists, the French rule of the Templars exists in a brilliant modern translation, which I would heartily recommend if you want to go deeper into the story as the first place to go, because reading the rule of the Temple is completely brilliant and immerses you in the mindset of the order. You get a clue in the first rule of the first bit of the rule of the Templars to have been written in the 1120s, late 1120s, which says that Templars, although they have joined an organisation which is modelled on the monastery, it's taken as read that they will not be able to, they will not have the level of literacy and the level of religious education to say the daily offices, to know the huge numbers of prayers that a Cistercian monk would have had to know at this time. And so they're kind of let off by being allowed to say a certain number of paternosters, our fathers, per day. And it's sort of 9 at breakfast time and sort of 13 when you have your cup of tea in the afternoon. You know what I mean? And I think that serves a twofold purpose. Firstly, the conflict between the role of the Templar as religious man and warrior meant that you couldn't be getting off your horse when you were chasing the Saracens around the desert to say a complex set of prayers, but you could say Our Father art in heaven 9 times without getting out of the saddle. Secondly, it also massively broadened your recruitment base, because pretty much the lowliest peasant in France you'd have hoped would have been taught the Paternoster off by heart, even if they couldn't read it. So I think literacy levels were much lower comparatively to other orders, religious orders. But there was also an expectation that they were a religious order, and that religious services and hearing the divine offices if they were in the commander of the preceptory, saying the paternoster if they're out in the field, were a vitally distinguishing and important part of this organisation. Thanks for your question.
Thanks for your presentation. There's been a lot of discussion recently among medieval scholars about the popularity of medieval history among within racist and Islamophobic discourses. As you noted, there are a few elements of medieval history that are more fruitful for all sorts of fantastical narratives, whether racist or not, than the Templars. So how do you approach those questions and those issues as you're writing? How do you try to speak into that context?
Yeah, this subject is incredibly live right now. There's no denying that at this moment, not just at this moment, actually, at this moment is becoming more visible, I think. The iconography, the symbolism, and a deliberately or ignorantly simplistic view of aspects of crusading history in particular has become very attractive to the far right in this country, certainly in Europe, very much in Britain, where I'm from, and that there are a range of Templar, in this case, Templar revivalist organisations that they run the whole spectrum. There are charitable Christian organisations who see in the model of the Knights Templar the opportunity to raise awareness of the difficulties experienced by Christians living in and around the Holy Land, and who want to sort of raise money to help, and are generally benign and well-meaning. But there's also a big middle of genuinely racist, neo-fascist organisations. If you, Anders Behring Breivik, the mass murderer, Norwegian mass murderer who killed dozens of people in Utoya 10 years ago, I think, claims to have been part of a refounding of the Order of the Temple in London. She said he and 8 other like-minded nutcases had undertaken to do, and that's kind of scary. It's kind of scary. You know, I've been working last year on a big drama about the Templars, which the iconography of white robes and red crosses looms large, and I know that the producers of that show are going to have to deal with, particularly on their Facebook sites, on their online profiles, a sort of influx of people who want to take that imagery and bend it to effectively a racist purpose. How do I deal with it? I try to, I explicitly have said in this book, what I said at the beginning of this talk, I want to sweep away a lot of the stuff that's surrounding this work, push it away and say what actually happened, and present it in its own context, of its own time, as a medieval history, and not as a politicized, in this regard, story. And that's what's presented in this book. But the conversation around that, for this and for lots of other aspects of medieval history, is very difficult. And I think the best thing to do is to be having that conversation, to be fighting deliberate misinterpretation.
This will be the last question.
That was you gave a very nice summary of the relevance of this history to current foreign policy, geopolitics. I'm wondering if you've been asked to talk at the schools of foreign policy and war crimes and so on that point.
No, not at the moment. I'm doing lots of events like this. I'm doing lots of sort of radio and podcast, but not at the moment talking to those kind of audiences. But I mean, I'll talk to the county, but it would be a good thing to do. Yeah. Thank you very much for always. Thank you for coming out on Wednesday night. You could have been anywhere, but you were here.
Once you're available to register, please remember to fold up your chairs, and the signing line will start to the right.